Oh dear, how money solves everything, including all my sorrows and my children's problems when they're being annoying. Huh?
Don't be that f***able. Money alone does not solve all problems. Now what? It's time to redefine generational wealth.
Hi there, my friends. Welcome to my channel where I talk about how to live mindfully for a happier and more peaceful life. Today, we're going to talk about the often divisive topic of generational wealth, what it is and why it's important to redefine and challenge it so we can all play a part in building that wealth. No, this is not a video detailing the 10 steps to make you rich. There's plenty of YouTubers who do that already. But rather, I really wanted to highlight why the way we view generational wealth is not conducive to the happier life that we all seek. This topic really came to my mind because, as you know, the economic outlook isn't always so rosy. With inflation and stagnating wages and ever-soaring costs of living, the average person in this global economy is feeling their little purse claps feel that much tighter. And we're all wondering the same thing. What does the future of our personal finances hold? And within the context, one trend I'm particularly noticing in articles, social media posts, and yes, even scholarly memes, is a vast amount of attention we place on the stark gap between boomer wealth and millennial wealth. How the average person is not able to afford the same living standards 50 years ago, particularly with home ownership because, you know, American dream, and hence the spiral of, are we just doomed financially? You only have to do a quick Google search to see the non-promising headlines of millennials are running out of time to build wealth. Millennials dominate the US workforce, but they're still 10 times poorer than boomers. And without realizing it, we attribute wealth as the sole source of happiness and perhaps start looking sideways and envy those that are better off through family generational wealth and start blaming those that do have higher numbers based off legacy. But all this talk about generational wealth is one-faceted and doesn't cover the full spectrum of what it means to be human and our future of happiness. The traditional definition of generational wealth is simply the assets passed by one generation of a family to another through various assets including stocks and bonds and real estate, businesses, etc. If we only hone in on this definition, yes, quantitatively speaking, the wealth gap continues to widen due to generational wealth, and for the majority of people, the outlook isn't as promising. However, if we're going to define our future through this data, it's almost like saying, this life of ours is not worth living. Might as well flee to Mars. And that undermines the fundamental pursuit of all humans to be at peace and to be happy. And monetary wealth alone doesn't solve that. To just give you one example, we have all heard or seen media portrayals of the rich kid who is, well, kind of and guess what? It's because rich children have serious challenges being happy too. In a Psychology Today article by Peggy Drexel titled Rich Kids, which I'll link below, the psychologist states that privileged kids as a whole are more self-centered, depressed, and self-destructive. They're more narcissistic, but they also struggle to develop a sense of self. While they are more likely to excel in academics and extracurriculars due to having more access to resources, this does not mean that they are thriving, as we say these days. Drexler goes on to cite a late 1990s research by Columbia professor Sunia that compared more than 200 mostly white, mostly rich suburban 10th graders with the same number of mostly black, mostly low-income urban 10th graders and found that the students with money were also more depressed. 22% reported clinically significant symptoms, and in subsequent studies found that high-income students were also more likely to experience anxiety, chronic academic difficulties, psychological distress, and delinquent behavior. And why is that? A number of reasons, and some include parents being too materially and emotionally indulgent, causing the kids to become entitled and tying their worth to family wealth. Parents being too emotionally absent due to thinking that money is the solution for everything, to even the rich children growing up and just learning to distrust the world when they see how others can take advantage of them just for their wealth. The list goes on and on, but one thing is clear. Financial wealth alone does not buy a child's emotional happiness, and the nurture plays a big part. And disclaimer, this is not to undermine those who don't have the money to make physical ends meet and the principle that money can buy basic forms of security for overall wellness. But we are often so focused on the benefits of being rich that we forget material abundance is not the sole predictor of our happiness, which is why it's necessary to redefine generational wealth so we don't disillusion ourselves to think that monetary wealth is the only thing that will yield happiness for our future self and the generations to come. Introducing upward mobile psychology. This is a term coined by Terence Real in his book called Us, that he touches lightly in the context of marriages going south, but it struck me as something that is absolutely critical for the future of our collective wellness. It sounds a little daunting, but in simple terms for me, upward mobile psychology is creating a happier and more connected world for our future generations through more sufficient and emotional nurture. We're all aware that no parents are perfect because we're all human, and generational values of what is considered normal and okay for child development changes all the time. And what was acceptable when we were growing up might now actually be heavily condemned. And add cultural nuances and context to this equation, this baby formula becomes even more complex and varied in flavor. But one thing is clear with upward mobile psychology. It takes on a much more human-centric approach than just money itself, because at the end of the day, money is just one of the many ways we seek to be happy. And the generational trends point to this direction too, with millennials and Gen Zs continuing to destigmatize mental health and making a priority beyond just material and monetary accumulations. According to the American Psychological Association, 35% of millennials and 37% of Gen Zers have received treatment or therapy from a mental health professional, while only 26% of Gen X and 22% of boomers have. You could argue that it's not like the old days and the world is more complicated and but mental health issues are not new. Depression and anxiety were not invented in the 1980s when the first millennial popped out into the world, but rather we're starting to shed more light on it. To go back to why sufficient emotional nurture of upward mobile psychology is so important, let's talk more broadly about what our younger brains are like and what happens when our upbringings were not sufficient. And for context, I'm using the term not sufficient because there's no such thing as a perfect childhood. What sufficient means in the context of raising children simply means being emotionally present and encouraging for the children so they grow up to have a healthy sense of confidence to show up and ask for what they need, and also extend that empathy and kindness to others. Back to Terence Real's book, Us, Terence cites an early 1950s experiment where Renee Spitz consulted various orphanages that had unusually high death rates in their infancies. All the babies were in fact fed and had their physical needs met, but Spitz found that these babies were never spoken to, jostled, or played with. In a word, they never emotionally synchronized with an adult. Failure to thrive syndrome was the official name for what happened, and ultimately led to the unusual high death rates of these orphan babies. We may sometimes be quick to dismiss the efforts of mothers and fathers giving their children love, but without a sufficient amount of it, we're not able to carry a healthy sense of self, suffer both physical and mental issues as a result, and carry on a slew of issues down the road. Terence words is eloquently stating that our nervous systems were never designed to self-regulate. Hence, parental figures demonstrating loving nurture early on are critical to our long-term well-being. But this is not to say that we need to grow up with extremely traumatic experiences to have problems later on. Turns out when we're children and our nervous system screams, "Am I safe?" over and over again, and are particularly vulnerable due to the evolving brain, even the slightest event in the eyes of a perfectly sufficient parent can turn into trauma for the child. Maybe it's a one-off snap during a bad day to the child that made them feel unworthy, or emphasizing just slightly too much on academics that made them feel like accomplishments are their only worth. And if we're not wary of those roots of these issues, we can catch ourselves thinking, why do I react this way? Or even if I lack that awareness, throw a rage, sob heavily, or seclude ourselves without realizing that many patterns from childhood carry over into our adulthood. And as time goes on and we settle into relationships, we find ourselves marrying our parents, even if your parents were not emotionally sufficient, and spiral the cycle of passing down our emotional problems for the generations to come. Terence phrases this as, we marry our unfinished business, where we seek partners that are familiar to us, in this case our parents, even if that means the familiarity and comfort includes subtle forms of emotional abuse or neglect we grew up with. Are we all a little masochists? Maybe. So as you can imagine, no quantifiable amount of money can buy us out of those family cycles. And until we start viewing generational wealth in the currency of sufficient nurture to build a happier future, the mental health crisis will only continue to thrive in tandem with the monetary generational wealth gap. But that doesn't mean it's a lost cause. With the increasing willingness of the younger generations to talk about mental health, the momentum is already here. And when we're able to redefine the metric of success for ourselves and those to come, the framework of upward mobile psychology will only continue to push us to reckon with the importance of emotional health for ourselves and for others. And good news, that actually starts now. Up till this point, we've been talking about upward mobile psychology in the context of parent and child relationship. But as we grow into adults, nurture is beyond your parents at this point. Yes, maybe we do move back into our parents' houses because, unaffordable rent. For us to leave our parental influences and becoming our own person is the immediate call to action that will impact how generational wealth gets passed down. You don't need to have children or plan to have them to make an impact on how our emotional collective wealth gets passed down. So what does that look like for us on the individual level? Two things. The first is to catch yourself when you go down the only monetary wealth can buy me happiness train of thought. As we live in an increasingly global economy, it's easy to default to that sort of thinking, but that linear form of thinking is not conducive to long-term change for our societal's collective happiness. And the more that you believe money is king, the more you'll pass down that ideology to those around you and those to come after you. Never underestimate your power as an individual. Sometimes all we need for a group is one person to raise their voice to affect change. And you might as well be that person when all your friends and family are still deep into the roots of capitalism, hoping that buying a larger house or elite education and material goods is the gate to future happiness. When we're able to shift that narrative into finally prioritizing care for our emotional health and hence influencing how we show up in this world, we're able to slowly utilize upward mobile psychology to chip away that capitalistic wealth narrative one person at a time. Again, you never know how much of an impact you have on others when, for example, you decide one day to forgive someone out of empathy rather than short circuit and blame others for their faults. The second point is to take that shifted narrative and take time to work on your emotional issues so we don't pass them down generationally. For many, the most obvious answer might be therapy, but there are also a myriad of ways to go about this too, such as noticing when your parents behave poorly and evaluating whether you exhibit those behaviors too, or taking the time to choose kindness and empathy when you know you're on the verge of saying something or doing something that you know will hurt others. Again, it doesn't have to be an overhaul of your life through cognitive or psychotherapy. Great if that's the path you decide for yourself, but the little day-to-day thoughts and actions are just as impactful. When we continue to remold our world through just that much more understanding and empathy to foster that collective peace and happiness, we are already slowly rewriting what a better future means for the generations to come. And one interesting point about therapy, if you decide to start that path, is to watch out for the blame cycle. I often hear people these days starting their own psychological journey and being able to pinpoint the issues they want to work on, but are perpetually stuck in the cycle of blaming their parents that block them from doing so. Like, it's my parents' fault that I'm this way, or had my parents done that, then so and so. Awareness is the first step to action, but without going further than dwelling in that hurt and wound, which still serves a purpose, we still continue to perpetrate the shortcomings our parents have nurtured us with. I wanted to close this video by sharing my own experience with upward mobile psychology. No, I don't have kids yet, nor am I even anywhere close to it, but I want to share why embodying this principle now is an important catalyst for generations to come. I'm Taiwanese American, but spent most of my youth and adolescence in Taiwan, where the traditional values of filial piety, thank you Confucius, reigns supreme. So what that looks like is a more organized order to society, but often at the cost of suppressed emotions and people lacking awareness of how important feeling and expressing your emotions are. I certainly grew up with this influence in the household and carried the sense of rejecting my own emotions even as I came to the US and started living in a more expressive society. It took many years, but through a lot of self-study, friends that embody a more open form of communication, and actually hardships that were induced by my inability to express myself, I slowly became more aware of how my upbringing was getting in the way of sharing my imaginative and inner workings. And through that awareness and slowly pushing myself out of my turtle shell, like taking initiatives to talk to strangers, or even the first time I called my best friend to just cry, I found myself living in a happier and more connected world. And while I've also encouraged my family to be more open emotionally, what mattered most is really what I am able to control. I knew that if I were to continue shutting myself in just because of my upbringing, then the future around me would remain just that, shut in, and that I would be setting the example for others that somehow shutting myself in was the way to go. Because shut in mysterious people intrigue others. But as I forged past my wounds to bring those connections into my life, I saw the difference and was able to extend that creative and empathetic fun self to others. And that's actually why I'm here today, having this conversation with you, to show that you have the ability to to help mold what our future holds, and that your happiness now is only a beginning of a series of emotional awards for yourself and the generations to come. And maybe, who knows, we might just be able to witness that future reality where the youth are 10 times happier and more connected because we have put in the effort to foster that good enough nurture. I hope you have enjoyed this video as much as I did creating it. Let me know if you've had any personal experiences breaking out of family molds to propel upward mobile psychology, or any questions you might have about it in the comment section. If you learned something from this video, give it some love and share it with someone you care for. And as usual, don't forget to like and subscribe and follow my other social media accounts for different forms of content. You got this. Till next time.